Welcome back to the nature of covalent bonding. This is part 2. We will pick up with a slight review of what we were just covering in the previous presentation. Recall that we had just talked about the fact that carbon monoxide doesn't quite get an octet around both of these atoms if we draw it the way it's suggested with just a double bond. If we take that unshared pair on oxygen and slide it over to create a triple bond by taking both electrons from the oxygen and having them both be shared between the carbon and the oxygen, then both get that octet of electrons. This is a special type of bond that we're going to discuss next. It's our last type of bond that we will be covering for molecules. When an atom contributes both of the electrons in a bond, which doesn't happen that often, but it does happen, that bond is called a coordinate covalent bond. A coordinate covalent bond can be indicated in the structural formula by drawing an arrow pointing from the donating atom towards the receiving atom, instead of just drawing a line for that part of the bond. So carbon monoxide would best be represented by the diagram here, showing one of those three lines as an arrow to indicate that particular pair of electrons came totally from the oxygen. Now, once it's formed, a coordinate covalent bond is just like any other covalent bond. The arrow in the diagram is just used as a reminder for us as to where the electrons came from. So the three bonds between carbon and oxygen are still considered just a triple bond. It was formed in an unusual manner, to be sure, but it's still just a triple bond. Ammonium and hydronium polyatomic ions that we learned last chapter are also examples involving coordinate covalent bonds, so let's look at those. When we begin looking at ammonium, it's going to form by ammonia, which you see on the right, and a hydrogen ion, H+. Now that H+ is just a little positive charged proton sitting over there because hydrogen usually doesn't even have a neutron in its nucleus. It's just a proton. So it's going to be attracted to any center of negative charge. And that means that that nitrogen with that unshared pair there, that unshared pair sitting out there on nitrogen is exposed to that hydrogen ion. And that hydrogen ion would be stable if it had two valence electrons to call its own. So it's going to go over and sit next to that unshared pair. When it does so, the empty s orbital can overlap the filled orbital in ammonia. That means that unshared pair is going to be sandwiched in between the two nuclei, the nucleus of nitrogen in the ammonia molecule and the nucleus of hydrogen in the hydrogen ion. So those electrons are going to be attracted to both of those nuclei. A bond forms when electrons are simultaneously attracted to two nuclei like this. In this case, it would be a coordinate covalent bond. The molecule would have an overall positive charge since we had that positively charged proton of hydrogen ion come over and join with it. Note that the coordinate covalent bond in this diagram on the right is depicted with an arrow going towards hydrogen, indicating nitrogen has donated both of the electrons in that bond. If we consider the structures for water and the hydrogen ion, we can see that it's going to do something similar, and there's two unshared pairs of electrons on oxygen, so we could come over next to either one of those and sit next to it. And when it does so, it's going to share that previously called unshared pair and form a coordinate covalent bond. And so the hydronium ion looks like this. Let's try to draw sulfur dioxide so that the structure satisfies the bonding requirements of all three atoms. The only possibility is that one oxygen is double bonded to sulfur and the other oxygen is single bonded through a coordinate covalent bond where sulfur donates both electrons. Now this can be drawn as either one of these diagrams. So which one is it? These two structures are called resonance structures, and so we draw them both, not just one of them. It was once believed that the molecule would resonate back and forth, meaning oscillating back and forth between these two structures, instead of just continuously holding one of these forms. Once again, experimental evidence contradicts the prediction. Evidence has indicated that the bonds in SO2 are equivalent to each other. That shouldn't be the case if one's a single bond and the other's a double bond, so how can we explain this? Now, those bonds have been found to be the same length and strength, which can only be explained if you assume that the actual bonding in this molecule is more of an average of the two structures. In reality, the bonding is a hybrid or a mixture of the two extremes represented by these two resonance forms. Resonance structures occur when there are two or more valid structural formulas that have the same number of electron pairs for a molecule or ion. They're drawn with a double-headed arrow between the structures to indicate both structures can occur. You should remember these are just a way to envision the bonding in certain molecules. Okay, so we've learned a lot of rules for drawing these structures, but we've seen one example where the rules get broken, and that was with oxygen, and that was very hard to predict. There are some other exceptions to the octet rule, however. Some molecules have an odd number of total valence electrons. That makes it impossible for each atom to satisfy the octet rule if there's an odd number overall. Others have some atoms with fewer or some atoms with more than 8 valence electrons, as we would see with lithium bonded to fluorine. So we see that the octet rule is more of a general guideline that can be helpful in many circumstances, but it's not always going to be satisfied. Now, we'll do this demo in class together, so I'll come back to this during class. The balanced chemical equation for the reaction we will be watching in class is shown here, and we can see that NO2 is one of the products produced in this reaction. And now, it's a pollutant that's also found in car exhaust. It gives smog, it's reddish-brown color, and it's very reactive and very poisonous. Try to write a structural formula for NO2, so pause the video and try it. The most stable structures that can be drawn are shown here. Now note, it's also possible to draw structures that place the unpaired electron on oxygen, but in this case we have an odd number of electrons, so it's just not possible for them to all be paired up. Any molecule that contains an unpaired electron is called a free radical and tends to be very reactive, which explains the highly reactive nature of oxygen, which we have found has only a single bond with an unpaired electron on each oxygen atom. When free radicals interact with each other, they share their unpaired electrons and create what's called a dimer. That's a larger molecule constructed of two of the radicals. When we have the nitrogen dioxide, two of them near each other will allow a bond to form between those two nitrogen, such as we see here, forming this dimer. This diagram represents the dimerization of nitrogen dioxide. Now sometimes, as I mentioned before, things can have too few electrons to satisfy the octet rule. Boron trifluoride only has 6 electrons around boron, as we see here. But recall that fluorine has a 4.0 electronegativity value, whereas boron is only 2.0, so the bonds here are more ionic in nature. So boron is essentially emptying out its valence level rather than trying to fill it with 8. Boron trifluoride can achieve 8 electrons around boron if it forms a coordinate covalent bond with another atom having an unshared pair, such as in ammonia. Nitrogen has that unshared pair, and that allows it to form a coordinate covalent bond where it donates both of those electrons to the boron. Some elements, such as phosphorus and sulfur, for example, will form bonds to more atoms than expected and end up with more than an octet. PCl3 follows the octet rule, but PCl5 does not. Try drawing each of them below, and we will go over them in class. Likewise, sulfur hexafluoride also breaks the octet rule. It's a very dense gas. Try and figure out what its structural formula would look like. And think to yourself about how many electrons are surrounding that sulfur atom when it's done. We'll discuss this one in class as well. I hope you have found this instructive, and if you have questions, feel free to talk to me during class about any of them.